It is true what people say, that it never rains, but pours when one is not prepared for it. Fred had arrived on our doorstep at noon, holding in his hand those urgent orders for me to go to Germany, to contact Steve, to urge him to query his contacts in Russia about the Russians' reaction to the unfolding financial crisis in the West. The urgency of Fred's order had made my fears even more real to Sylvia, and so they added another weight to the tragedy of her own situation. She had to deal with the possibility that the financial system might break down while I was out of the country. With Fred's promise to stay with her, she appeared to sense that she wasn't abandoned and alone at the most critical moment in her life, while struggling in hospital undergoing major surgery. In the way that Fred spoke to her, I began to recognize that he was actually fighting with himself to acknowledge that the principle that fulfills the needs of the many has indeed no value if it doesn't fulfill also the needs of the one, whereby the fulfilling of the needs of the one become recognized as a key element in fulfilling the needs of many. Fred didn't speak about this directly, as evidently the weight of the recognition was still unfolding in his mind, even while the spirit of it became increasing evident, as he tried to assure himself that by supporting her critical needs he was indirectly fighting in support of our larger mission that could not be allowed to fail. It seemed that he took the challenge on as something that he stood not as powerless against as in the big arena, but could sink his teeth in to make this work by taking the sting of pain out of an exploding crisis. It is vital for us to know whether the Soviet government is inclined to hit us with a nuclear strike when the chips are down in the West, said Fred gently in an effort to give her a sense of the severity of the crisis and the urgency of my task. He handed her another envelope. It contained a civilian airline ticket for a Lufthansa flight leaving 7 a.m. the next morning. He explained to Sylvia that he didn't know that she couldn't join me on the mission. Sylvia started to cry, quietly, bitterly. "This can't be happening," she uttered between a stream of tears. "I'm undergoing the biggest medical procedure in my entire life tomorrow." She turned to me. "I need you to be with me at my side. You can't go away, not tomorrow." "I can't hand the mission back to Fred," I said quietly. "I can't turn my back to the whole world for the seriousness of the situation." I explained the reason why it was serious, and critical also for her own life too. "Send somebody else, please," she said to Fred. Fred sat down beside Sylvia and shook his head. "I wish I could," he said, "but there is nobody else in the entire world who can do this mission. Pete knows the people. They trust him. I wish I had a dozen people like Pete who could take on these kinds of missions. But I only have one. We have to struggle through this together. I can't stop the world. I wish I could. All that I can do is stay with you and support and help you in any way I can. I am urgently needed in Washington, but I'll stay here with you. I'll do this for you, though I probably shouldn't be away from Washington in this time of crisis." "I have urgent needs, too," Sylvia replied, crying again. She turned to me. "Can't you understand my situation too? I'm facing a huge medical procedure that will put me under the knife for 4 hours. I'm scared of what might happen." She turned to Fred. "And now you want to take Pete away from me too, and for what? Can't this be done by phone?" Fred shook his head. He began to cry too. He understood both sides, and I understood his, but all this apparent understanding didn't prevent all three of us from crying. We all knew this couldn't be handled by phone. "The president's advisors have already urged the president to launch a preemptive nuclear strike," said Fred, when the tears had subsided. "His advisors are determined to force the president to prevent the Soviets from taking advantage of the financial disintegration in the West. It took all the diplomacy that a number of people and I could muster to persuade the president to hold back until the results from this mission are in this war of nerves a single day is critical. Thank God we have this connection that Pete established with Steve. It may have bought us one more day to prevent the worst." Fred turned to Sylvia. "We've got no options for this reason. Pete has to go. If Pete won't go, I don't know what will happen." He has to be on the first commercial flight tomorrow morning. He can't go by special transport. This would tip them off, which might put Pete in danger and spoil the whole mission. This, then, would wreck our last hope. Isn't it possible to delay the surgical procedure by a day or two? I interjected. Can't this be done for national security reasons? A word from Washington can move mountains. Can something be done along this line? Fred shook his head. Getting Washington involved like this would be like erecting a billboard on Times Square advertising your secret mission, Fred replied. After a while, Sylvia stopped crying. We both packed our bags. Fred stayed around and organized something for dinner to give us time for one last walk together before the sunset. The next morning's parting was a sad occasion. Sylvia was half asleep still when my time came for me to leave. We didn't even wake Fred, who stayed in the spare bedroom for the night. We both wanted to be alone for this sad farewell. We kissed and wished each other well with a gentle kiss and a smile. I knew that by the time I would be in the air, her surgery would begin. She soon fell asleep again. She didn't have to get up for another half hour. The weather was clear that day. Luckily I had a seat by a window, and on the side of the aircraft from which I could see the hospital, where her greatest trial was about to begin, probably at the same time that the plane flew by. As Fred had promised, he, and also Tony, would have brought Sylvia to the hospital by then in my stead, and have remained there with her. I felt grateful for their doing this for Sylvia. A friend of her also promised to be there with her. Still, I should have been there too, being with her instead of flying away. I felt like a traitor. I was leaving her alone in the most critical hour of her life. I had tears in my eyes when I could no longer see the hospital from the air that had been visible only for a few minutes. Soon the city itself receded into the background of the world. I pressed my face tight against the window to look as far to the rear as I could, but minutes later there was nothing of the city left in view. All that I could do was lean back into my seat after that and close my eyes to be with her. I realized that in spirit I could be there with her. And so I was. In spirit I was not running away. I knew that physical distance isn't really an obstacle to thought, and the zero-distance reality that we had begun to experience towards one another. In thought we could still touch each other. I remembered her smile and her kiss of the morning's farewell. I remembered Helen's lateral lattice of hearts, where no one exists outside the universe of the bonds of love. Oh God, take care of her, I prayed in the shadow of my far too feeble understanding of the principle of Helen's construct of the lateral lattice imagery. However, one aspect of what Helen had told me about her experience in observing the lattice coming to light suddenly jolted me. Helen had seen in this lattice the principle reflected by which the needs of the one outweigh the needs of the many, by which her friend's needs had been supplied in his critical period of a similar manner, likewise during surgery. By the time we had reached cruising altitude, when the seat belt signs were turned off, a kind old gentleman sitting in the seat beside me asked if my tears were for someone special whom I had left behind. I nodded. She should have been here with me, or I should have been back there with her, waiting in the hospital, I said quietly. Physical space does not separate people, the man replied. Only people can do this. They do it in their mind. I told him that this didn't seem logical to me, though I sensed it was true. It is provable, he replied. How? All right, tell me, in which century did Solon of Athens, the great reformer, grow up in? And in what century did the great Confucius begin his renowned reform teaching in China? I couldn't answer him. They both lived in the 6th and 5th century BC, respectively, said the man. This means that the kind of thinking that brought about the Greek cultural revolution, which eventually set the stage for the development of Christianity, was echoed in all essential aspects in faraway China, in the form of the famous Confucian ideology. There also exists a close similarity between the Confucian and the Christian perception of the worth of the individual human being, so much so that one would suspect collaboration. But this couldn't have happened. The two regions of the world had been essentially isolated from one another at the time. he asked. Was that a coincidence? I shrugged my shoulders. No, my friend, that was not a coincidence, he said. It couldn't have been, because the same sort of thing happened again many centuries later during the next major cultural development period, the period of the Golden Renaissance. At the exact identical time frame that the Golden Renaissance began in Europe, the greatest cultural development period began halfway around the world in the Andes of South America with the development of the Inca culture. Many of the aspects of civilization that came with the development of the Renaissance were found reflected in the development of the Inca culture, regardless of their vast geographical separation. The similarities are such that one would again suspect collaboration between the two cultural developments had the areas in which they occurred not existed in total isolation from one another. He pointed out that this happened prior to Columbus discovering America. The undeniable coincidence of great cultural developments occurring simultaneously in geographically isolated regions of the world, and for this to happen repeatedly, points to the existence of a universal unity that binds all humanity into one. This unity is barely recognized to exist. Much less is it understood. It appears to be a dimension of our universe that we are but faintly aware of, the spiritual dimension. There have been experiences of spiritual healing reported throughout the ages, amazing experiences that should not have been possible. They totally defy what we understand about biological processes and probabilities, but they happened. Apparently they happened in all cultures, spanning a vast range of time from the ancient shamans to the modern Christian scientists. We found them happening in the hidden jungles of the world and on the streets of America. I agreed with the man that we have barely begun to discover the human dimension. The man suggested that these occurrences were sufficient proof for one to recognize that separation and isolation are indeed invalid concepts. Are you saying that we, as human beings, are living in a spiritual universe where distance and isolation in space and time do not apply? I asked. He shook his head. I look for something higher than that, he said. I see us grander than that. In my perception, we are completely spiritual beings coming to light at the present stage in a material form, unfolding in a material universe, but endowed with a humanity that is totally spiritual. This humanity is our soul, the divine soul. It is also our love, the divine love. We are bound to our humanity with the heart of our love, with which we uplift ourselves and thereby one another and bring light to the world. Spiritual all powers all of this. Some call it divine principle. Ultimately, we are subject only to that which is the reality of our being, and the higher evidence of that is found in the spiritual dimension. In that higher dimension of reality, we can never be separated or isolated. In this reality, God and man are one in being, and that reality defines us all as one, which we are in truth. This leaves not a single person out. In this truth, there is but one I, or us there is no separation possible where all is one, in being. This oneness is not just a unity in spirit, but is a practical unity, a concrete unity, that reflects the unity of our humanity. Therefore, the infinite intelligence that we call God, that we all embody in countless ways, is also reflected in the wisdom and the alertness of the doctors that will treat your friend, said the man. So, there is no need to fear, he added. The truth is then also reflected in your thoughts as you see your friend endowed with strength and in the care of intelligence. What you know and understand of this reality and acknowledge to yourself will be reflected in the peace of this hour in which no separation has actually taken place in truth. If your thoughts are focused on that reality which I told you about, then your friend's critical hour will be filled with peace for both of you. It will be an hour filled with joy and power. This is an interesting concept, I almost whispered as I pondered his words. You said that there is but one I, or us in a sense. I think I have known this for all of my life. I have always been embracing people in thought, especially women. I know you have, the man answered. And then again, you haven't. You had an inkling of the idea. You speak of being especially attracted to women. This may be from an invalid standpoint. Most people seek to create unity, even intimacy, without knowing that the unity they seek does already exist. It exists as a fundamental principle that pertains to us all, which unites us into a unity in which we are one in being, which unfolds individually in individual expression. Unfortunately, most people do not allow themselves to see this and feel this. I could sense that the man was right. I thought of Ushi. I thought of the unity I had felt with her, and still did. It had existed fully and completely from the first moment on that we met. I hadn't created it. Nor had she caused it. It had existed like the air that surrounds us. We had merely discovered it, and had allowed it to unfold, and then had developed the discovery further and further. It had been the same with Sylvia Wright from the start, and it had been the same again with Heather. That unity still existed in thought, even with Heather, who had walked out of my life, and was probably still felt by her, wherever she might be. Whatever had stopped the unfolding of that unity had nothing to do with anything that is fundamentally true. The unity that we had discovered had not ceased to exist. But you are also a liar, the man said, cautiously at one point. You said that you are especially attracted to women. You may have had deep-reaching intimacies with them, but is this special attraction true? My experience tells me that this cannot be true. If there is but one I, or us, this principle is paramount. You cannot escape from it. What he said puzzled me. Yes, I admit to having had deep intimacies with several women, I said to him, to prove my point, but never with men. I don't believe this, said the man. How can you ignore the very thing that is happening between us right now? I am not a woman, but we share deep thoughts. Now tell me, to whom do you go routinely when you seek advice, or when you need to share your innermost thoughts with someone? Give me a name. The name is Steve, I replied spontaneously. I rest my case, said the man. This means that you have been lying to me, admit it. But more importantly, you have been lying to yourself and didn't realize it. But how did you know? You told me yourself. I told you that I was lying to you? How could I have, if I didn't know it myself? I knew that you were speaking a lie when you said that you were especially attracted to women, because this limitation is not possible. As I said, the principle that underlies all being is imperative. No one lives contrary to it, or apart from it. It may be possible that one is not aware of it, and ignores the evidence, but the fact remains that this principle is a real factor in everyone's life. We spoke about a lot of things along this line, especially about things that are contrary to this principle, like so many long-standing myths. He brought up marriage as an interesting case, because the marriage principle acknowledges the deeply natural unity that exists between men and women, while at the same time the established model of it rejects the underlying principle of universal unity that the model is founded on. It rejects to a large degree what it should reflect fully. Thus it became an institution that erects walls and fences between other men and other women, said the man. Marriage has become a paradox, he said, because the isolation that it imposes against others is contrary to the fundamental principle of being. This is why we have prostitution as the oldest profession, and why people have affairs outside the established model, because the established model doesn't yet reflect reality. People try to deal with this paradox in the best way they can. They are struggling to be honest with themselves to the fundamental reality of all being, but too often the incomplete model stands in the way. In many cases this acknowledgement is made at a great peril to the people involved when the established marriage laws, which create the paradox, are violated. He made the point that it doesn't really matter what laws are instituted by society, including the legalized ownership of human beings by one of another, because these laws cannot overrule the fundamental principle that there is but one I, or us, so that no separation is possible in truth. He said that the artificial laws can only cause people to lie to themselves when they feel they must claim ownership rights over other people in order to protect something, not realizing that what they aim to create for this purpose already exists naturally in a much richer fashion and on a much wider scale. The man said that marriage is an interesting case. We don't know how it developed. The practice is very old. It probably predates the pharaohs of ancient Egypt. It may have evolved in the earliest times from an honest response to the principle of unity that forever asserts itself and reasserts itself. If one adds to this the heightened attraction between men and women, that is a natural component for assuring procreation. A special bond may have evolved that was built on respect, affection, even love, which became a commitment to one another that reflects the principle of unity that was not so much understood as it was felt. This may have resulted in a natural response of honoring one another at the grassroots level. He turned to me. You must realize that unity by itself is an incomplete concept. It can only exist as a part of a much larger concept that also includes generosity, respect, honor, and affection, all of which are kindred aspects of our humanity. If one takes away any one of these, the rest has no meaning. The discovery of this fact may have been the original foundation of the marriage bond, and Egypt may have been the place where it unfolded first, because Egypt was simply the richest place on earth at the earliest stages of civilization. Egypt was rich in food because of the Nile, so that the people had time and energy to spare for the development of the mind. This opened the door to all kinds of scientific discoveries, and also to vast stores of knowledge in all kinds of fields. The early Egyptians may have been the first to discover some aspects of the underlying idea that God and man are one in being, that there is but one I, or else their discoveries along this line might have come to light in the same manner as an archaeologist uncovers the faint outlines of a priceless hidden treasure. This usually occurs when the surface dust is brushed away. The kind of unity that the early Egyptians appear to have established was evidently rich with life, respect, honor, generosity, and affection. We find this reflected in their art and in the way they honored their pharaohs. We can also see evidence of it inscribed into the stones of the great temples that they created. Then the man spoke about the ownership rights that circumscribe marriage today, which were probably instituted for the protection of the gentle bond that was formed in the face of competition. He suggested that this might also have been necessary in the early ages, when the principle of the natural universal unity was not sufficiently recognized. Even in Jesus' time that larger principle was far from being understood. The man beside me suggested that this might have been the reason for Jesus' comment on marriage, "Suffer it to be thus now." He also suggested that Jesus had made it clear that this compromise has nothing to do with the fundamental principle of unity, and promised that the compromise would fall away when the reality of one's being becomes more fully understood. Don't you think the time has come for society as a whole to deal with this reality more fully? I asked at one point. People have dealt with this for centuries, and have not understood it. They have only felt it, said the man after a long period of silence. That is why prostitution is one of the oldest professions, and why people have affairs. But they only deal with the superficial aspects of the principle of unity. They move with some gut feeling, instead of the imperative of an understood principle. Still, this gut feeling moves them powerfully, more than we want to acknowledge. Moments later, the man asked me if I have ever danced the tango. I said yes. Then you have been touched by the power of this principle of unity, he said, of which sexual intimacy is a valid expression. He explained that the tango has its roots in the immigrant society of Argentina, where men had once outnumbered the women 45-1. The only intimacy that many men could experience was that which they paid for in the bordellos of Buenos Aires and in other cities. And even there, the competition was stiff. The man explained that a client was expected to dance at least 3 times with a prostitute before the intimacies could begin. During these dances her client must prove his worthiness. So you see, even there, he added, we have a certain acknowledgement manifested that unity cannot truly exist without respect, honor, and affection, acknowledging to some degree that all three are one. In fact, generosity appears to be a part of it too, and perhaps even a major part. Out of the competition for intimacy with a woman in the bordellos, for which the tango was developed, he said, driven by the force of a deeply underlying principle, the tango emerged as an art form. It became a unique and sexually enticing style of dancing. It is said that the competition became so intense between the men that the men could be seen dancing in the streets, practicing their steps, often alone or against each other, and everybody knew what it was for. Apparently there was no shame in it, because the whole process was built around respect, honor, and affection. And yes, I believe there was a great deal of generosity interwoven into the process. He paused a minute, then he added, this is partly why I couldn't see any validity in your statement that you are especially attracted to women, because respect, honor, and affection have nothing to do with any specific sex. He almost laughed. The point is, said the man a while later, that one cannot escape the reality of the underlying principle. One may ignore it, especially the deeper aspects of it, but one cannot get away from this principle. I also know that you are ignoring a vitally important element of it right now. He said to me, you are lying to yourself about one of the deeper aspects of this principle. We were halfway across the Atlantic when he said this. I assured him that I did not lie to myself. No, I can't see it in your face, he said. You are afraid of death as a reality. You are afraid that your friend might die in the hospital back home, and that you will never meet her again. If you believe this, you are lying against the very truth that you already know by now. If you could understand the validity of this truth, you would feel its reality as a powerful force in your life, as powerful as the immigrants in Argentina had felt the underlying unity between men and women, and had brought this truth to bear in their situation, in whatever manner they could, in order to experience it. I nodded. I admitted that I was struggling with this fear. In spite of the fact that Sylvia's operation was not as risky as other procedures are that invade critical areas, I couldn't help but fear for her life. She had never been a strong woman, physically. The fear of death had welled up in ever-recurring waves. Each time I had fought it back. Death is not a possibility, said the man. Nothing can break the unity of God and man that embraces us all. Nothing will ever change this reality because it is anchored in truth. Life is an aspect of truth. You shouldn't burden your friend with your fears about dying. You should acknowledge life as the reality of your friend's being. No parting can occur that would contravene the unity of God and man. But people do die all the time, I countered him. Forget about time and space, said the man, and explore the principle of timeless being and the inseparable oneness of God and our humanity, in which there is no parting or separation. This principle is imperative. No exceptions can occur that would reverse the fundamental principle of the dimension of spiritual being. People die only in the realm of belief. Even in the most ancient civilizations, people had gained a certain sense of that, especially so in Egypt. Except many cultures have failed to realize that the oneness of all being that manifests itself as unity, built on respect, honor, and affection, is not bound to time and space. It contains no physical elements by which it could be limited. People, unfortunately, don't allow themselves to experience that. As I pondered these things, a great peace came over me that came from knowing that nothing would or could separate Sylvia and me, ever. Only this peace was quickly replaced with a new fear that suddenly reasserted itself. I remembered Helen's lateral lattice that represents mankind's universal oneness as a vast array of human hearts supporting one another in times of individual need. I tried to visualize it as Helen had visualized it during a time of crisis, in a process of helping her friend who had been likewise struggling in hospital. But I couldn't feel the vitality that Helen had seen, and had understood scientifically, and had brought into everyone's being. Suddenly it dawned on me that Sylvia's operation would likely be already over at this point of our flight. At this moment, I realized that a different fear was nagging me. This was perhaps the very fear that had been nagging me before the flight was even on the agenda, the fear for which I was on the way to Europe on a mission designed to stop a nuclear war. I told the man why I had left Sylvia behind. "So you are prepared to lie to yourself again about this aspect of our humanity," the man answered. "There exists no principle that supports a nuclear war, or any war. Nothing exists that counters the fundamental principle that God and man are one in being, which unites us all. The fact is, Russia doesn't want a nuclear war, nor does America, nor does anyone else. This is the truth. Tell this to your president. This must be the basis of your mission, that you expect nothing to manifest itself that is not founded on this fundamental principle of unity. There is no need to start a nuclear war, nor any other war. When people go on a rampage and say that to kill a Jew or a communist is like killing a dog, just like this occurred during Hitler's time, they are not speaking the truth. They are speaking politically created lies. These lies alone create nuclear war. People don't. These lies have no principle. They are created by a few beastmen who are dead themselves as human beings who have a special objective in mind. This is why it is so important that one always goes back to the fundamental principle that God and man are one in being, that there is but one I, or us, which binds the whole of humanity into one union across time, space, status, color, creed, sex, and political beliefs, even commitment to bestiality. Something bothered me about the man's response. His perception seemed profound, but narrowly focused compared to Helen's lateral lattice of a universally interconnected humanity, in which division and isolation of any sort is inconceivable. I told the man about Helen's concept of the principle of universal love, a love for our own humanity, and all humanity. I told him about those three elements that Helen recognizes to be represented in this universal lateral lattice, the elements of peace, joy, and power, with peace being manifest by the universal cause, with joy being manifest by universal economic development, and with mankind's power being manifest by science. The man looked at me perplexed. Then his face lit up. "What you are talking about is an infinite concept," he replied. "What I have been talking to you about is a minute kernel of one of the three elements, the element of power. I have been talking about an aspect that unfolds with scientific development in the spiritual domain. Religions divide humanity. Nevertheless, we are a spiritual species. We are sentient, highly intelligent, we can discover and understand complex phenomena, we can understand them scientifically, we can be creative, write music, poetry, drama, we are also creatures of love, joy, honor, integrity. These are all spiritual qualities. They have no material dimension. They are uniquely human qualities without an equal in their universe. Being human qualities, they are subject to development on a scientific basis. However, these are only the generally acknowledged spiritual qualities of our humanity. Who can tell what further spiritual qualities and spiritual dimensions are inherent in our humanity that we are not even aware of as yet? It is absurd to believe that we have reached the limit of our understanding, even of ourselves. He paused. In real terms, we don't know anything yet, because we tend to block our door to discoveries, he said moments later. The force of gravity is an example. According to nuclear physics, it shouldn't exist. All matter is understood to be nothing but constructs of fast-moving points of energy, and energy has no mass in itself. So where does the mass come from? And where does the force come from that causes a mass to have a hold on another mass, like the sun has a hold on the earth? No physical link has been discovered by which a form of physical mass has a hold on another mass, no matter how far apart they exist. No shielding has yet been discovered to break this infinite hold. And this is where the problem lies. We look for physical causes standing behind a physical effect, and thereby we close our mental horizon to all other potential causes, especially those that are not physical in nature. In order to understand what is really going on, we need to break out of our mental self-strangulation. To the degree we do this, the horizon becomes wider for us. Gravity isn't an enigma on the wider horizon, I interjected. Gravity exists because the universe wouldn't exist without it. It is a phenomenon of intention. Everything in the universe starts with the phenomenon of intention. The intention becomes reflected in universal principles. We discover the principles, but we ignore the intention that is expressed in them. And so, we are puzzled with enigma after enigma. The man just smiled as I said this. And what controls the intention? He said to me, there is an amazing intelligence at work here. The intelligence is reflected everywhere. There is not a single iota of anything in the universe that is self-existent. Nothing exists that is not subject to the harmonizing spirit of the all-encompassing intelligence that determines the principles of the universe and their outcome. And this includes us, too. No one is self-existent. Even what we call biological evolution is nothing more than the universal development of the one organism, that is the universe infinite self, and by reflection our divine, boundless self. And so, we are not isolated. Nothing in the universe goes through the development process in lone isolation, without benefiting the whole, for the simple reason that the universe is one single whole. That's what an organism really is. It is an organization of individual elements, such as individual molecules, or individual biological cells, or individual sovereign persons. In the organism of our body, all cells exist in a subjective role to its organization. Are you saying that this applies also to us as individuals of a society? I interjected. That's exactly what I am saying, said the man emphatically. The universe is a universe of principle. The same principle is visible everywhere. We find it reflected in different forms perhaps, but it unfolds uniform in essence. It applies socially, just as it applies biologically. A biological organism is essentially a society. It is a society of cells. We see the same principle reflected there that we see reflected in our larger society, and vice versa. We are interlocked in both realms. While it is probably correct to say that the DNA coding that we carry in each of the cells in our body contains the blueprint of our body's entire architecture, we also recognize that there is a certain specialization of the cells happening that determines the individual cell's relationship to the whole. The specialization appears to be determined by the cell's intercommunication with one another. The leading-edge researchers now recognize that over 90% of the DNA's functions involve bioacoustic, biochemical, and bioelectric signaling between the cells. Through these, the organizational patterns are expressed so that an eye appears in the right form, and at the right place, and is maintained there, and is constantly being renewed. There are vastly intelligent processes involved in the DNA processing that shapes the unfolding of life. None of these evidently happened accidentally, but involve states and stages of intentions, and their expressions in myriad forms. Some researchers suggest that only 3% of the DNA functions are devoted to actual protein manufacturing. In the same sense, we, as individual persons, are also the constituents of the larger, universal organism of mankind. Like the cells are in constant communication with each other, so are we as spiritual beings in a constant intercourse with one another, whether we like it or not. There are spiritual pathways in operation that we often experience, but have not yet explored. Many stories have been told of people having felt the impact of extraordinary events happening to people close to them, while they were physically separated by vast distances, in some cases extending halfway around the world. This tells me that we are a single humanity. We don't exist separate from one another. And we naturally support one another in this unity. Isn't sexual attraction an example of this constant intercommunication that we really cannot get away from? I interjected. My friend Steve thinks this has a powerful purpose. He says that it exists as an expressed intention to draw us closer to one another. The more our culture advances, the more we depend on one another. He seems to think that sexual intimacy plays a powerful role in creating a cooperative and supportive intimacy in the social, scientific, national, and international environment, even our feeling to one another as human beings. His take is that sexual intimacy is a vital spiritual element in the fulfillment of a larger intention that is crucial to our physical existence. Steve tells me that we are just beginning to discover how vital sexual intimacy is for the overall functioning of the organism of our society, as you have put it, by looking at the consequences that ensue when critical aspects are amputated, that diminishes the sexual intimacy. "You are referring to the circumcision," said the man, "aren't you?" "I am well aware of the serious nature of the consequences." He explained that the consequences of the sexual amputation have shaped the nature of the Jewish culture for millennia. Vast consequences are involved resulting from the circumcision, said the man, with effects that have led to the almost universal persecution of the Jewish people and the expulsions of them from many towns and lands, endlessly repeated for centuries. The expulsion of the Jews from Spain, and the murdering of them by the Inquisition, or the mass extermination of them in the Nazi Holocaust in later times, are just examples of the extended effects of the circumcision on people. These tragedies are not responses without a cause, but are reflections of a deep-moving impetus that, like a disease, has festered for centuries. And the tragedy is widening. More than 500 million Muslim men now live as circumcised victims. Your own country, my friend, has more than 100 million men circumcised. Some researchers call the psychological consequence of the victims having been deprived of a large portion of their sexual sensitivity, culturally inherited mass disorders. The disorders are recognized by a variety of well-defined symptoms. And the outcome, my friend, is tragic. Just look at the Middle East. We have 3 circumcised cultures locked into an endless war against each other: the circumcised Jews, the circumcised Muslims, and the circumcised Americans. It didn't used to be like that, I interjected. America was once a free country. The concept of freedom that you speak of doesn't exist anymore in America, said the man in a quiet tone. The masters of empire hate the concept. It interferes with their game. They pull the strings and watch their puppets dancing. That's the freedom you are allowed to have. But would the American society be dancing as it does if it hadn't been conditioned for the dance by the circumcision that has cut deep to the very core of its social fabric? Now guess under whose influence America became circumcised in the first place. The force for it came from the center of empire through the conduit of Atlanticism in the wake of World War II. And as for the Muslim victimization, this was evidently intentional too. The masters of empire have long maintained an Arab bureau, going farther back in time than anyone can remember, specifically targeting Islam. The empire's connection with the Jewish culture, and with their utilization of its people as self-conditioned pawns, has a long history, indeed, as long as the history is of the modern scourge of empire itself. Most likely, none of the great wars in modern history would have been possible without the circumcision. Nor would the notion of empire still exist on this planet without it. This vast body of accumulated tragedies, my friend, shows how vital sexual intimacy really is for the functioning of a civilization. We see its value reflected in what is lost without it, I interjected. The man nodded. But ultimately you cannot judge its value that way, he said, and continued in the same quiet tone. Sexual intimacy is a part of the development of society's inner self. That's how its value must be measured. I think society is beginning to recognize this, faint as the recognition may still be. We are beginning to recognize its value on the road of scientific progress. More and more it is becoming apparent that the ruling dictators in the world are not isolated archetypes, but are reflections of a society's self-imagined incapacity for freedom, reflected in society's failure in governing itself, in organizing itself, in recognizing its inherent power and humanity. Dictatorship is a form of psychic tyranny that fosters a lack of responsibility and the neglect of human freedom, causing society to beg to be ruled. There is no intimacy left in society. Rape results without intimacy. The tyrants latch onto this permissiveness. And so, they are not isolated from us, but are tyrants by permission. They are a reflection of us as we see ourselves. They are one of us. The tyrants are a reflection of our fear and apathy, collectively, and our hatred, which are all symptoms of our failing to love, and mostly of our failing to love ourselves. Until we can heal ourselves of this failing, we remain stuck in these endless cycles that depress our happiness, that shred our rights as human beings, and imprison us into hierarchical political systems that are rife with cold, unyielding bureaucracies that have less and less to do with human living. While we are working ourselves out of this trap, progress is slow. Nevertheless, it is slowly becoming recognized that the acceptance of inferiority in society breeds the acceptance of superiority that the tyrants depend on. While we are gradually beginning to realize that we are all essentially one single people with a common divine soul, the acknowledgement is lagging. Especially considering that the details have many faces, so that many a healing is yet required. Nevertheless, the trend that I see is set in the right direction. I also think that we have barely begun in recognizing ourselves as one people, so that great freedoms lay yet before us in our advancing self-recognition. Science recognizes no inherent limits in the development of the human understanding, especially the understanding of our spiritual dimension. Are you saying with that we haven't seen anything yet, in terms of our sexual development and the development of sexual intimacy? I interjected. Steve sees this unfolding as steps of experiencing our third sex, our spiritual sex, where the intimacy becomes even tighter, such as in art, music, science, discovery, creativity, just to name a few. In a sense, we have always known that there is more to be discovered and to be recognized about our spiritual dimension, said the man. The resulting speculation has led to numerous conjectures that gave rise to all the great religions of the world. But they all became stale and became lost into the back alleys of single little issues, rather than driving the development of our universal development. This process remains yet to happen. For the moment, the religions have lost their purpose as they no longer fulfill the ever-growing human needs in a world where human development has stopped. Humanity stands divided by the multiplicity of its conjectures, over which countless religious wars have been fought, and more wars might yet be fought, before our inner development has caught up with the growing human need. We need to get to the truth, which lies beyond the conjectures that divide us on so many fronts, including the sexual front. And I think we are making progress. Our conversation right here is a proof of this. And why shouldn't this truth about ourselves, that we can't yet see, be located and be understood in the domain of science? Science allows us to search for reality on ever higher levels of perception as we develop hypotheses and prove the hypotheses and then supersede them. Science has become the new name for religion. Sure, science is still strangled with many lies, superstitions, and false notions, just as the religions have been strangled, but we are on a new train with a new engine. That's the level from which I have been talking. From a higher level of scientific development and demonstrable proof. Sometimes it becomes necessary to resort to old terminology to verbalize the advanced concepts. Therefore, in essence, what I have said to you earlier is all correct. I must have stared at him in amazement. He suddenly stopped. I think there is a new language being spoken on the new train, I said quietly. The language is that of the principle of universal love. This is new territory. The development of this language needs to flow from our experiencing the essence of this principle in our living. And this we have barely begun. This makes the seemingly incredible that you just presented to appear credible. Oh, you find it hard to believe me, said the man. I don't blame you. There are only a few people in the world who talk, like I do, who say the things that I say. Scientific development is not on the agenda yet, especially if it is pursued for its own sake. A few pioneers fielded some aspects, but those were lost sight of as society didn't reach high enough at their time to recognize them. Still, the pioneering contributions are a facet of our humanity too. Scientific development is not in vogue yet. In fact, it is not allowed. It is suppressed whenever possible, but the march is on. There is a movement afoot. And the same goes for economic development. Development has become a bad word. Society has been taught to destroy, to steal, and to depopulate. That's what America's infamous NSSM 200 document is all about. But fewer and fewer people are now riding this train. You probably heard of NSSM 200 and its genocidal objective. It states that America's goal is to destroy the populations of Africa and other continents so that they don't use up their natural resources that America might need in the future. Therefore, the policy was concocted to destroy the targeted people's economic potential. The global warming hoax is used more and more for this purpose, as you may also know. The empire wants depopulation. It wants it as a means for protecting its existence from a new renaissance that no form of empire would survive. Thus, the word empire is synonymous with genocide. That is what every war of this century has been fought for, destruction to inflict genocide. The goal of the masters of empire has always been to destroy the development potential of mankind in order to protect the power of empire that exists by creating universal weakness and poverty in society. That is why America has been set up to eradicate Russia. And to do this in a process that will wipe out both nations together, thereby clearing the world of its greatest renaissance potential. And if this fails, surely the unseen rulers of the world will set up a different game in which Russia, America, China, and the entire Muslim world will destroy one another. The only game that is not being talked about is economic development, much less global economic development. I can think of no greater joy than to see such a development happening. But it isn't happening yet. Still, the movement is on. Economic development isn't happening yet because too great a portion of society is still living in the old world, the world of empire, rather than in the world of freedom. Today's society appears to live so distant from this goal that it might as well live on the moon, I interjected. But I also see a dawning in society of the recognition that we are all one people, which is a key turning point towards the freedom of economic development. The age of monetarism, that is key to empire, is already in the twilight zone. Its mythology is becoming ever more recognizable. The myth that the privatization of wealth is good and creates a rich society is fast blowing away with the wind. We are nearing the threshold, even while society still lives at a great distance from its heart and soul. Nevertheless, the idea is dawning that this separation does not reflect the universal principles of our humanity. Therefore, the current trip to hell is on the side track already, and will soon be halted, as this track goes nowhere. And let me tell you, my friend, going nowhere is synonymous with hell in humanist terms. Now I am beginning to understand a bit more of my friend Helen's concept of the universal kiss as the element of our peace, I said quietly. The man just laughed. He also nodded. Doesn't the universal kiss also extend to your heart? Kiss your humanity with joy. Those who don't do this will say to you, who wants peace? They will tell you instead that what people really want is gold, and they mean your gold, if you have any. Stealing is easier than building. That's the way people think whose kiss does not extend to their humanity. The field is presently wide of those who shun their universal kiss. The bimbo owners want your gold. There is no kiss in the bimbo shop. They give a shit about your humanity and anyone else's, and why should they? Why should they care if people have no kiss for themselves, for their own humanity? Sex has thereby become a commercial commodity, like soybeans and pork bellies. At the social level too, a world devoid of the universal kiss creates windfall profits for the divorce lawyers. The man paused. Universal love is the great universal principle, he repeated. That's the kiss within the kiss that has been scrapped. There is no love left for anybody, because people have no kiss for themselves as human beings. Even the so-called scientists are now fighting each other, and they lie to the public. They also lie to each other. If you want a cause for destroying humanity, all you have to do is go to the scientists that sold their soul, and there are many of them, and they will give you what you want for a price. Years ago, a few concerned scientists started a global conference to talk about what economic developments might be needed for mankind to survive the coming ice age. Guess what happened? In order to prevent any talk about the large-scale economic development that would be needed to get the world ready for the coming ice age, a bunch of hired scientists came to the rescue of the empire and created the global warming mythology. The Imperial's moneybags have paid for it all, in full. For a few jinkles in their pocket, many traders, who call themselves scientists, have prostituted themselves to serve the goal of destroying the global economies in a process designed for taking away 80% of the world's energy fuels. Just wait and see. All of this madness is already set up to happen. And it will happen if no one chooses to stand up for the truth. People lie because they have no kiss for themselves as human beings. There is no intimacy in this scene of lying and stealing. People live millions of miles distant from their heart and soul, and from their humanity. Yes, and that's how the critical choices are now made in modern times, I interjected. People live in sky castles, dreamscapes built on lies. Sure they do, said the man. But all the lies in the world can't prevent the ice age cycles from recurring, as they have with clockwork precision for the last 2 million years. The lies only become reflected in society's response to these cycles. The critical choices that should be made that would enable a growing world population to survive in an ice age environment for the next 100,000 years are not being made. Here we face the effects of the paid-for lies. And those effects cannot be avoided. The reason is simple why this happens, I interjected. Society has been put to sleep by the potion of greed. Greed takes the joy out of living. Of course, this can only happen when there is no kiss. Greed darkens the earth. It is the ultimate killer of humanity. It is the most potent killer that has ever been invented. And the only power that stands against it, as far as I can tell, is the power of what my friend calls the universal kiss. When people resort to it, as a universal principle, the kiss that they extend to themselves and to one another as a matter of principle becomes the light of their life. The man nodded and completed my reasoning. The principle of the universal kiss is the principle of universal love, he said. But, strangely, he spoke in a tone of mockery this time. People will hate you for saying that, he said. You are challenging their illusions which they cling to with a passion. You are challenging them with the truth that they don't want to know, and have been carefully taught to reject. In the dark world of their educated ignorance, the world of the lateral lattice that your friend saw and experienced in operation is deemed to be a dream of an irrational mind, and more so are truth and love. They will scoff at you for speaking to them about it, even while this principle defines the reality of their being. I predict that people will sooner shoot each other dead before this advanced concept will be put onto the agenda, even marginally. The most powerful people in the world, past and present, have devoted their life to assure that the Treaty of Westphalia, that once put the principle of universal love onto the map in the form of the principle of the advantage of the other, which are both reflected in the universal kiss, will be eradicated so thoroughly that people will never know that these principles ever existed in history. The man became quiet after this. As for myself, he said, I find your concept of the lateral lattice absolutely accurate and beautifully stated. It is the best definition for universal love that I have ever come across, with elements of peace, joy, and power. I love the concept of peace as the outcome of the universal kiss. It's brilliant. But will we see it translated into reality in our lifetime? No, I can't see how this is possible, said the man. I know the unity of humanity is intact, but who will embrace it, and go many steps further than just embracing it? Then you are saying that we will not survive, I said to him. Without love on the horizon, we have no hope. When the Anglo-Venetian American Empire financed Hitler into power, it created a mess that took the entire world 6 years to clean up. When the empire took its next step and urged the construction of the atomic bomb as a terror weapon for forcing all nations into compliance, it created another mess that the entire world has not been able to clean up in 50 years and won't be able to clean up without the principle of universal love and the universal kiss. Of course, if those bombs go off before this mess is cleaned up, the resulting firestorm will likely create a level of destruction that may take hundreds of thousands of years to overcome. Now tell me again that you believe that there is nothing that can be done. In this case, I have to tell you that you are mistaken. We will fight for our humanity and for all humanity. My friends and a few others, we will fight. Whether we will likely win or lose doesn't change anything today. We will fight. We will fight for the love of our humanity. We will not betray this love. Will you join us? Will you acknowledge that we are all one people? I told him about our nudist-beach project that we were working on. I told him that I had put up $93,000 to recreate the mental environment of an embrace of our humanity that is as full and profound as the embrace of the truth would be if the proverbial tree of false knowledge had never come into play. He nodded. We all have to get to the stage, he said. The process is similar to peeling an onion. It is the highest form of society self-education. You peel away the false concepts and the lies that have been built up over the centuries around us, layers upon layers. Whenever we begin to shed these layers, even to some degree, a new renaissance begins. We have seen this again and again. Then the renaissance becomes again smothered with lies, but the lies become peeled away again, and another renaissance begins. One day the lies will become discredited before they accumulate and cause the horrific destruction that they always cause. But how close we are to this final point with the feeble footsteps that are being taken, no one can tell. I wish that I could promise you a victory. But then, if I did make this promise, you would stop fighting, wouldn't you? The man never said how far we had already advanced towards reaching this vital goal. By the time I had brought the subject up, we had arrived in Frankfurt. As soon as I got off the plane, everything that the man had said became confirmed. I telephoned Fred Antoni, who had stayed with Sylvia in the hospital. Fred confirmed that Sylvia was fine and was recovering in post-op. He said that she would be back home before I would be back myself. As I also found out later that day, Steve's answer, too, reflected what the man had said. Steve told me that the Soviets were not eager to start a war at this stage. He had heard this from several of his contacts in official channels. He said that neither did the Soviets believe that this partial collapse of the West financial system could be regarded as a sign that the West itself was about to collapse. Steve said that he had made those inquiries in anticipating what my visit would be required for. Thus he was absolutely certain, from what he had heard, that the Cold War stalemate would drag on in the same fashion as it had for all those years already. Steve assured me that this was also the way he saw things personally. Steve even insisted that I should have seen that too.